You're likely all familiar with Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships. But have you heard of Helen of Sparta, a princess and a queen who offered her husband legitimacy in his rule? Have you heard of Helen of Olympus, the daughter of the king of the gods himself? Have you heard of Helen of Egypt, who was whisked away by the gods and hidden for the entire duration of the Trojan War? Or have you ever just simply considered Helen, a mother, a wife, a lover, a daughter, even a goddess, and very simply put, just a woman? That's the Helen I want to talk about in this video, because for me, Helen of Troy, as she's often known to modern audiences, is one of the most fascinating figures of Greek mythology. Not only because she comes up again and again and again in our sources. Our oldest piece of ancient Greek literature follows, yes, the journey and emotional journey of Achilles during the Trojan War, but it's about a period in ancient Greek mythology which is heavily linked to Helen, and she does feature in the Iliad, if I didn't mention the title there. She then continues to be the subject of classical Greek tragedy. She crops up in later Roman texts. She has cults dedicated to her. She is such a significant figure, and like I said, she just comes up again and again and again in the ancient material, and her name continues to be used and sometimes abused throughout the medieval and modern era. She's somebody that even if you don't know the details of her life, you've probably heard the name of. But do you really know her? Do any of us know her? Because what I find unfortunate about many discussions surrounding Helen is that she's often put into a box, and that can be said of many figures, particularly women of Greek mythology. They are boxed in, they become quite flat, they have to be one thing or another, and Helen is somebody who has very much fulfilled that role. Yet if you go back to the ancient material, I actually find Helen to be an incredibly complex, layered character who we can start to see these really interesting facets of through the various parts of her story, which go far beyond just the Trojan War itself, and that's the Helen I want to talk about. So in this video I plan on tracing the history of Helen in mythology, so from birth to death, what happens to Helen, with yes, the Trojan War falling in between, but many other events surrounding those, as well as their variants. So some of the versions of Helen's story are not always consistent, which is a major feature of Greek mythology in general. And then I also want to talk a little bit about the history of Helen since antiquity up into the modern day, some of her modern reception, and pose some questions about how we might consider Helen a little bit more complexly and what potential Helen possibly has for further modern adaptations, because I truly think the time is nigh for some more Helen adaptations. So Helen is the daughter of Leda, queen of Sparta, and Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods. So you may be familiar with the legend of Leda and the swan, in which Zeus, king of the gods, sexually assaults Leda in the form of a swan, something which is very much in keeping with Zeus's behaviour in countless myths. And from this encounter, Leda becomes pregnant and she lays 2 eggs. Although in some versions she's also had sex with her husband that night, so there's a little bit of confusion about who entirely is the father of all of her children, because Helen is not alone. Helen also has 2 twin brothers, Castor and Pollux, who you may know as the constellation. In addition to these siblings, she also has a sister named Clytemnestra, who is mentioned frequently in the narrative of the Trojan War, and 3 more sisters that you hear much less of and actually won't hear a ton about in this video either, but they are Phoebe, Timandra and Phileno. Now, regardless of her potential divine origin, she is raised as the daughter of Tyndareus and Leda and a princess of Sparta, and she develops a reputation as being incredibly beautiful, something that she may very well have inherited from her divine parentage of Zeus. And it's interesting because you hear a lot about the semi-divine parentage of a lot of male heroes in Greek mythology, like Perseus and Heracles, but in conversations around Helen, I find it's far less common to hear about the fact that she is potentially semi-divine herself and the daughter of a god. However, rather than say strength, her gift is her beauty, although gift is perhaps a difficult word to use for something that ends up causing so much trouble and that she didn't necessarily ask for. And when I say she developed a reputation, I mean from a very early age. So when Helen is still in her pre-teens, there is already this idea of her that has spread across the different city-states of Greece in this sort of like mythological historical period. In fact, kingdoms is probably the better terminology to use in this instance rather than city-states at this point. And that includes it having gotten as far as the ears of Theseus, who is the prince or eventual king of Athens. Now, Theseus and his friend Pirithous decide to make a pact. They decide to make a pact that they deserve to marry daughters of Zeus, the most beautiful, the most incredible, the most powerful women out there, the daughters of the king of the god himself. And so they decide on two. Theseus decides that he will marry Helen, who again, at this point is still in her pre-teens, and Pirithous decides he will marry Persephone, who's also the daughter of Demeter and a goddess entirely in her own right, so like perhaps aiming even higher. So in order to make these women their wives, they decide that they will abduct them, because this is Greek mythology, and Theseus goes to Helen's father's kingdom. He visits the palace in Sparta, and during the night he kidnaps Helen. He whisks her away and takes her back to his own home in Athens. But rather than marry her immediately, he leaves her behind to travel to the underworld with Pirithous in order to kidnap Persephone, who at this point is married to Hades for his friend. There's absolutely no point at this stage in questioning the logic of certain decisions in Greek mythology. This is just what happened. Unsurprisingly, that trip doesn't really go to plan, but it's not the point of this video. We're here to focus on Helen. So Helen at this point is just left entirely alone in Athens, away from home, abducted by this strange man, no idea what's about to happen. But of course, back in Sparta, her family have discovered that she's gone. They knew Theseus was there. They guess pretty easily that Theseus took her. So her brothers, Castor and Pollux, go on a mission to save her. They invade Theseus's kingdom without really any problem because Theseus isn't there. They save Helen and they take her back home. But one of the reasons I find this story so interesting is because it sort of defines Helen's myth from an early age. It sets up what is to come later, and that is the way in which men will fight over her because of what she offers them. And I don't just mean her beauty, but also her power and her lineage, and how she connects the men she marries to different households, whether that be the household of the Olympians like Zeus or the Spartan kingdom of Tyndareus, and that's something I'm going to talk about later. But in a way, although we talk about Helen's beauty, and although I've talked a lot about Helen's beauty here and this reputation that she developed and how that reputation continues to be quite pivotal to the story, one of Theseus's major motivations was her tie to Zeus. So it's never just about the way she looks, but actually the men that she gives other men access to, and I think that's really, really important. And one of the ways in which Helen as a woman is dismissed by the men of Greek mythology and sometimes Greek mythology itself. She isn't always given the opportunity to be the multifaceted, complex person that everyone deserves to be. And that's not to say that's true of all ancient Greek texts. I actually think there are some excellent explorations of Helen's layers in ancient Greek texts. I just think it's worth pointing that out, that sometimes we forget about those. So now Helen's home, and she presumably lives quite a peaceful life for the years that she is there until she is of an age to marry. How old exactly is unspecified, but worth noting is that sometimes there is a bit of a misconception about how young women are expected to marry in antiquity. They are certainly not expected to be wed while still prepubescent, and I think that's really important because I've seen a lot of like weird misinformation about that, or little assumptions about that online. And in Sparta in particular, it's generally accepted that women won't marry until they're at least around 18 or older. So that might apply here, but also this is a myth and it's not necessarily stipulated or relevant. So Tyndareus had a very important decision to make. Who should wed his daughter, his beautiful, impressive, wonderful daughter who had men clamouring after her, really. But important to note here, not just clamouring after her, because with Helen comes not just a wife, comes a kingdom. Whoever marries Helen will also become king of Sparta. Helen comes with a kingdom. And I think that's something that often we forget when we're talking about Helen in a modern context, that she is the key to kingship, to the rule over a very politically important kingdom in ancient Greek mythology, the kingdom of Sparta. So although her beauty is a factor, there are other reasons why these men are coming from throughout the ancient world in order to ask for her hand. And Tyndareus realizes early on this could lead to some serious feuds between people. Whoever doesn't get Helen's hand is going to be annoyed, and that's most of them. So he's scared what might happen next, what might happen to his daughter, to his kingdom, what might result from the feeling of rejection that her suitors who do not win her hand end up having. Perhaps he even recognised in them the same sort of desperate greed that he'd once seen in Theseus and failed to counteract. So Tyndareus is in a bit of a pickle, shall we say, until he is approached by one of the wisest, most cunning men of Greek mythology. At least that's how his reputation precedes him, who is of course Odysseus. And Odysseus has recognised at this point he's probably not going to win Helen's hand if Tyndareus is to pick a winner. He has a kingdom of Ithaca, but he's not exactly the most impressive, the richest of all of the men here, and he sees an opportunity. He can't have Helen, or at least he's not likely to get Helen, but he might be able to win himself another queen if he can impress Tyndareus with his plotting and planning. So he goes to Tyndareus and he says, I can ensure Helen's safety and that there won't be some big war fallout from all of her suitors if you can ensure me the hand of your niece, Penelope. So Penelope, who does eventually become Odysseus' wife, is Helen's cousin, and Tyndareus is more than happy with this solution. He says, absolutely, I will set up that marriage, I will make that connection, you can marry Penelope if you can solve my problem. So Odysseus, with his wily words, goes to the rest of the suitors who are presumably gathered around the palace in Sparta, and he says to them, Tyndareus will pick one of us as Helen's husband, but before he does, let us swear a sacred oath that whoever should marry Helen, we will support that union, we will not interfere with that union, and if anyone should in the future interfere with that union, separate them, take Helen away, whether through her choice or not, we will defend it. We will go to the ends of the earth to ensure this union survives, and we will defend Helen, defend her husband. Not exactly sure what the motivation is there, but we will protect that union. And of course, at this point, everybody except Odysseus is still hoping to marry Helen, so they go, yeah, absolutely, I will swear this oath. It means if I win Helen's hand, then I will have my union protected by all these kings and princes. So they all swear the oath, and sacred oaths are taken very seriously in Greek mythology. So this is something they are going to abide by no matter what. And this gives Tyndareus free rein to choose who he would have marry his daughter, and he chooses Menelaus. Now Menelaus' brother Agamemnon is also among the wannabe suitors, and in order not to annoy him, in order not to put him on bad footing with his brother, Tyndareus offers Agamemnon his other daughter, Clytemnestra, and everybody's cheery, happy. The oath has been sworn, they will protect Helen and Menelaus' union, it's all good and everything ends happily, right? Of course not, it is Greek mythology. But for a few years at least, things seem to be peaceful enough. Menelaus becomes king of Sparta with Helen as his queen by his side. They have a daughter named Hermione, a name that you might recognise. It's been popularly used since then, not just by Shakespeare, but Hermione is the daughter of Menelaus and Helen. And that might have been it if it wasn't for the gods' interference. Because whilst Helen is living with her husband, who, whether she loves him or not is unclear. This is a royal marriage, very few of which are love matches, but this is the marriage that Helen is in, and this is the life she's essentially leading until everything changes. Because whilst all of that is going on, like I said, the gods are up to something completely different. This is another incident in mythology I find very fascinating, because basically something else is going on in Greek mythology involving the gods and then a few other mortals that have nothing to do with Helen. Helen, like I said, is living her life. All of this stuff is going on completely separately, but because of all of these little events that trail into one another, that lead into one another, they end up massively impacting Helen's life. So in order to discuss Helen further, we have to discuss what has been going on the other side of the mountain, perhaps. So on Olympus there is a wedding. The wedding is between the goddess Thetis and a mortal man named Peleus. Now in Greek mythology this is the final ever wedding between a god and a mortal. And it's also the union that gives rise to Achilles, because Achilles is the son of Thetis and Peleus. But there is one goddess who's been left off the guest list, and you may know her name. She is Eris, goddess of strife, who you can kind of understand why she wasn't invited. Like, who wants strife at their wedding? Nobody. So they don't invite her. But they also fail to consider the consequences of not inviting Eris, because she is deeply offended by this and decides to show up anyway. She crashes this wedding and she decides to cause exactly what they hadn't wanted, a little bit of strife. Although the strife itself doesn't necessarily impact Thetis and Peleus, which is alright, so that's okay. But the strife does impact the goddesses there, because Eris throws a golden apple into the crowd and she says, "This golden apple is for the most beautiful of the goddesses. It will land beside whoever is the most beautiful." But of course it lands exactly equidistant between three goddesses, Hera, Athena and Aphrodite. And there's one thing that all Greek gods and goddesses have in common, and that is that they are vain and they want to be the best at everything. So of course they all say, "The apple is mine, I am the most beautiful." And somebody needs to settle this debate. They go to Zeus, but Zeus knows better than to get into the middle of an argument between three other powerful immortal beings, and he says, I'm not the right person to judge this contest. Let's get this random shepherd. And this shepherd is Paris. So Paris has two names, Alexander and Paris, and that is because he lives his early life in hiding. Rather than living as the Prince of Troy, he's living as a shepherd. And whilst he's living as a shepherd, Zeus approaches him and says, "I'm going to need you to decide which of these three goddesses is the most beautiful. No pressure." Of course, a lot of pressure, and Paris is overwhelmed by this decision, so each of the three goddesses offer him a bit of a bribe. Let's be honest, a prize if they pick him. "If you pick me, I'll give you this." Hera offered him the rule of all of Europe and Asia. Athena offered him all of the wisdom and skill when it came to war and battle that one man could possibly have. And Aphrodite offered him the hand of the most beautiful mortal woman in existence, because, you know, she was not available. And Paris, for whatever reason, found this the most compelling bribe and chose Aphrodite as the winner, thus ensuring him the assistance of Aphrodite in taking Helen's hand. So we're about to get onto one of the most highly debated sort of issues or topics surrounding Helen's story, and that is whether she was abducted against her will or whether she fell in love with Paris and fled with him. But I think it's really important to establish from this point, Helen, regardless of whether she falls in love or not, has no real choice. It has been ordained at this point by the divinities that she will be going with Paris, or at least they are going to try and get her to go with Paris. So choice and free will are very difficult terms to use, not just regarding Helen, but a lot of figures in Greek mythology, because a lot of their fates are preordained or have two very specific paths that they might follow. So I think that's really important to always bear that in mind when talking about Helen. That is always a factor in the back of our minds. It should always be a factor in the back of our minds, and it's always a factor in the background of the myth. And so the scene has been set. Helen has been promised to Paris by a goddess herself. So it is that Paris travels to Sparta, stays with Menelaus and Helen, as is the guest culture in ancient Greece of welcoming strangers into your home and making all accommodations for them. However, whilst there, Menelaus has to leave to attend a funeral, and whilst he is away, Paris takes the opportunity to flee back to his royal home in Troy with Helen. And this is the moment in Helen's story which often has the most debate around it. Did Helen want to go with Paris? Did she not want to go with Paris? Now, I think it's really important to emphasise at this point something I emphasise in all of my videos concerning Greek mythology, and that is that there is very rarely one standardised version of a myth. And you will find throughout the sources from antiquity, going back to archaic Greece, through classical Greece, Hellenistic Greece, and into the Roman Empire, that there are those sources which say Helen went willingly and Helen went unwillingly, and those that land land somewhere in between. And because there's so much debate around this subject in particular, I think it's pertinent to hone in on it a little bit more here and discuss it in more detail. And also because I think this is the moment in Helen's story where she becomes the central character. In some ways, the way in which Helen's story is recorded up until this point makes her seem like an almost background character. We don't hear her voice in any of the sources. She's very much objectified. She is an object to steal or to win. And this is the moment when you start to see Greek sources express Helen's feelings and her thoughts and opinions on what is going on in her life. For example, in Homer's Iliad, one of the oldest pieces of ancient Greek literature that exist and the oldest written account of Helen's story in part, it's much more than that and much less than that at the same time. It does give voice to Helen in certain moments. But while it's the earliest surviving source that sort of examines Helen's perspective and her time in Troy as part of its narrative, it would be incorrect to refer to anything as a definitive version of a myth, so I wouldn't go that far. And it also remains quite ambiguous. So by all accounts, it does appear in Homer's Iliad that Helen chose to leave Menelaus. She chose to leave Sparta and go with Paris to Troy. When in conversation with Paris's father, King Priam, she refers to herself as having followed Paris and having forsaken her home. Sort of active language that implies that, you know, this was something she actively did and chose to do rather than being taken from her home. Of course, like I said before, there's always a difficulty in using the word choice and free will when the gods are concerned anyway. She does, however, express regret over this decision in this very same conversation. She frames it as a decision she made, but she regrets having made it. For whatever reason, whether it's that she doesn't have the feeling she thought she had for Paris, or because of the violence she has since witnessed since leaving Sparta. There is a great deal of sort of sadness and regret around the decision that she made, and she expresses that quite vehemently in the Iliad. Now, one thing you will find occasionally in ancient Greek sources and in modern reception is a tendency to blame Helen for what happens next. As you may know, because of Helen going to Troy, whether willingly or unwillingly, Menelaus sets about getting her back, and because of that oath that was sworn earlier in the story between him and the other Hellenic kings and princes, they all join together as an army against the Trojans, and under the guise of rescuing Helen, they start a war. For some, they perceive Helen's selfishness in going to Troy, again, whatever choice she had in that, as resulting in the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of Trojans and Greeks. However, that's not what Priam does in this moment in the Iliad. He specifically blames the gods for the war that has occurred. And it's important to note that in the Iliad, there is a lot of vested interest from the gods in this war. They are somewhere between spectators and sort of puppeteers in this war, and they are taking sides, some on the Trojans, some on the Greeks, and they're playing battles amongst themselves that don't in any way affect them, yet end the lives of all of these mortal people. In contrast with Helen's sentiment, however, we have a few different figures in the Iliad express a desire to rescue Helen, specifically Nestor and her husband Menelaus. They express what they are doing in fighting the Trojans as an attempt to avenge Helen, therefore sort of framing it as a much more unwilling departure. But they don't seek out this vengeance because of some deep-seated care for women, because Nestor also suggests that because a Greek woman was stolen, they should in turn steal all the Trojan women, framing either the seduction or abduction of Helen as an insult to Greece as much as it is an insult to Menelaus or to Helen. And I will say, I do use the word Greece here. They didn't refer to themselves as Greeks. They would have used the words Achaeans or Helens, but because it's familiar, I'm going to keep using Greeks here. So it sort of becomes more complicated, doesn't it? Do they really see Helen as a victim, or do they see their sort of people and their culture and their society as having been disrespected? can that be simultaneous with them perceiving Helen as a victim, or is it just a part of their sort of political propaganda? And as far as I'm concerned, that ambiguity is intentional within Homer. I don't think Homer in the Iliad is trying to say one scenario is right or wrong. He is painting a picture of a very complex war scenario, which it would have been. And another topic which I touched on a little bit earlier is that in losing his wife, Menelaus also is in danger of losing his legitimacy to claim the throne of Sparta. He is only king of Sparta because he is married to Helen. So in having Helen taken from him, he's also having that legitimacy cast into shadow, into doubt. So it's also too simple to suggest that he sees his ego as having been hurt, or he just misses his wife, which are obviously possible contributing factors. Then there is the idea that Troy is a very rich kingdom, and you know, to defeat Troy is a massive boon for the Greeks if we look about it in a more broad sense. So there's multiple motivations that motivate this war beyond Helen, and there are also instances of wives who are abducted or who have affairs in Greek mythology that don't then lead to wars. So we have to consider all the complexities about why this war might have happened, even if it is in a mythological situation, and I think it would just be straight up wrong to blame any of this on Helen, and therefore that's one of the reasons I kind of hate the term the face that launched 1,000 ships, because it's sort of putting responsibility onto her shoulders when a lot of decisions were made by the men around her, and that is what led to the deaths of many men and women around her. Another point that I think is important to raise here is what Menelaus plans to do once he rescues Helen, because although in the Iliad he maybe paints himself as a sort of avenging angel type figure, we see in other sources such as Euripides' Trojan Women, which is a later Greek play, that his intention is to kill her, or at least one of the possible outcomes of having gotten Helen back after this massive war that's apparently about getting her back is then just to kill her, because he wants to punish her for what she did. So one of the motivations for getting her back in this whole complex soup of motivations is just to punish her. And I don't laugh because it's funny, but just because it's all so ridiculous. Now, he doesn't end up killing her, and I will get on to what happens next in a minute, but I want to carry on discussing motivations and how decisions were made in terms of Helen's fleeing from Sparta. Because while King Priam in the Iliad doesn't blame Helen, there are those that do. We see Electra very much sort of paint Helen, her aunt, as a bit of a demoness almost, as the one that is the cause of this horrible situation. In Euripides' play Electra, Andromache in Euripides' play Andromede refers to Helen as not a bride but a ruin, and Hecuba in Trojan Women, or Women of Troy by Euripides again, who is the wife of King Priam, directly refutes Helen's claims of having been abducted, which she claims in this play. So unlike saying she did it willingly in Homer's Iliad, she says she's abducted in Euripides' Trojan Women, and Hecuba replies these words. So I'm going to read you Coleridge's translation here. Enough of this. My son carried you off by force, so you say? What Spartan saw this? What cry for help did you ever raise? Though Castor was still alive, a vigorous youth, and his brother also not yet among the stars? Then when you had come to Troy and the Argives were on your track and the mortal combat had begun, whenever tidings came to you of Menelaus' prowess, you would praise him, to grieve my son, because he had so powerful a rival in his love. But if the Trojans prospered, Menelaus was nothing to you. Your eye was fixed on fortune, and by such practice you were careful to follow him in her steps, careless of virtue's cause. Now that's just one woman's opinion, that's Hecuba's opinion. In the meantime, Helen is presenting the opposite side of the argument. She is framing herself as being abducted. And Euripides' play doesn't necessarily lend itself towards the audience landing on one side or another either, because remember, Hecuba, whilst condemning Helen, is a Trojan woman who has seen her entire kingdom destroyed. So she is angry, and she does not like the Greeks, and she does not like Helen, and Helen on the obverse is saying that she was under Aphrodite's spell. She had no choice, and she didn't wish to leave her husband in Sparta. So who's right? Whose rhetorical argument do you believe? You don't necessarily need to come away from that play in particular believing anybody, but it does present both of those arguments. And I could probably film a 2-hour video solely on the topic of whether Helen was abducted or whether Helen was seduced, and to what extent she was a willing participant in her abscondment from Sparta, because there is so much to say just within the ancient Greek texts themselves. But I hope in just highlighting a few examples to you here, I've managed to highlight and draw attention to that ambiguity and how there is not necessarily a correct version or a correct interpretation of the ancient evidence. For example, one of the sources that is actually the focus of my PhD thesis, which you can read online if you're really desperate to, is Hyperides' funeral speech, where he references the story of Helen and he explicitly frames it as a sexual assault, as a abduction committed by a foreign prince against a Greek. But in doing so, this orator is using Helen's story as a tool to create a sense of national identity and unity among Greek soldiers. So there's also the motivation of the writers to consider when you're looking at how they interpret or how they present Helen or anybody's story in ancient Greek mythology, because myths change according to the purpose with which the teller is telling them, and that is the case in antiquity as much as it is today. And I don't just say that as a modern commentator, because the Greeks themselves were entirely aware of this, as is perfectly demonstrated by Gorgias's encomium of Helen. So Gorgias was an ancient Greek orator, rhetorician and sophist who wrote this encomium or defence or praise of Helen as a rhetorical exercise. This is basically a rhetorical teaching tool in which he's showing his students how to make a good argument. And throughout this rather short text, he makes a case for all of the different reasons why Helen might have left Sparta, whether willingly or unwillingly, and how regardless of the reason that she leaves, she is not to blame for the Trojan War, which some might disagree with and which Gorgias himself might not believe, because what he is doing here is making a rhetorical argument and demonstrating the power of rhetorical arguments. I will, however, share with you the 6 reasons that Gorgias presents for Helen's potentially leaving Sparta. 1 is that the fates dictated it. 2 is that the gods dictated it. 3 is that necessity dictated it. Helen was forcibly taken by Paris, or Helen was seduced by Paris. And finally, Helen was overcome by love, but love is of course a divine manifestation that cannot be disagreed with. And in particular, when he references Paris' seduction in order to differentiate it from the overwhelming sense of divine love, he also mentions Paris's wily way with words and his clever use of rhetoric to compel and seduce Helen. And again, according to Gorgias, whichever of these reasons you choose, Helen is not to blame. And with that, I'm going to draw a line under my discussion of Helen's departure itself by giving you absolutely no answers and probably only more questions, but by emphasising the fact that really it will always be a question which we cannot answer. And now it is time to discuss what happens to Helen in Troy and afterwards. So after Helen is abducted, as I mentioned before, all of the Hellenic kingdoms come together along with Menelaus and Sparta to retrieve her. They sail across the seas to Troy and envoys are sent, including Odysseus, to ask for Helen back before they, enact war, and Paris says, nope, she's my wife now, and the war begins. The Trojan War is a multi-year war. It is a massive part of ancient Greek mythology that had a massive impact on ancient Greek society, and it comes up again and again and again, and it involves so many figures, from Achilles and Patroclus to the Amazonian warriors to the Trojan prince Aeneas and so many more. And for that reason, I'm not going to go into a terrible amount of detail about the Trojan War here, because my focus of course in this video is on Helen and what's going on with Helen. But know that this war is taking place and raging outside the walls of Troy for years, whilst Helen is spending that time in Troy potentially going through this inner turmoil. In fact, she spends a lot of her time in sort of a protected section of the palace and the kingdom with the other women, and she is so detached from the war in some senses that it's actually not until 10 days after Paris dies that she learns he is dead. Specifically, Paris was shot in the heart with an arrow launched by Philoctetes using Heracles' bow. But the death of Paris did not lead to the end of the war, because it had grown so large, and in some ways because it had always been beyond Paris. It was bigger than Paris. It was a war now between two peoples, two nationalities, if anything. And rather than return Helen to Menelaus after Paris's death, she was actually forced to marry his brother. So at this point, it doesn't matter whether she chose to marry Paris or not, she did not consent to marry his brother. And so Helen's third husband is Deiphobus, who presumably sees Helen as this sort of like symbol of power, this symbol of power, that has been the sort of centre of this war for so long, and he wants to claim that. So she then becomes Deiphobus's wife. This marriage, however, is far shorter than her other two marriages, as the events that follow are really those that lead to the end of the war. So one night Helen is actually visited by a man in disguise. A man in disguise is a beggar, but who is in fact Odysseus, her cousin Penelope's husband and one of the Greek warriors. Although he wouldn't admit his identity, Helen recognised him even though nobody else did, and she brought this beggar into her own chambers in order to bathe him and care for his wounds, finally forcing him to basically admit who he was. And at this point, Helen actually becomes an active participant in ending the war and on the Greek side. Now, of course, there could be multiple reasons for this. She could just see how Troy is failing, she's lost Paris at this point, why not go back to Menelaus? Or she could have always wanted to escape. I'm not going to get into debating which is the answer because I don't think there's any definitive way to prove either way. But she asks Odysseus to share his plans with her, and he does so, informing her that a prophet has told the Greeks they will never win the war unless they possess the Palladium, which is a small statue of Pallas, the daughter of Triton, which was carved by Athena. So he has come here in order to steal the statue so that they may possess it and may win the war. Now, Helen has been in Troy for many, many years, so she actually knows exactly where this Palladium is. Although it is heavily guarded, she gives Odysseus instructions on where he might find it, thus, like I mentioned before, actively participating in ending the war. Odysseus is successful, he gets the Palladium, he takes it to the Greeks, and that's when they come up with this whole plan to build the Trojan horse. The Greeks build this giant horse on wheels made of wood, and they pretend to abandon their camps, leaving this as an offering to the gods, hoping that the Trojans will believe that this is just an offering they made to the gods because they realised they couldn't win the war. And when the Trojans look out over their walls and see that the Greeks are gone and they've left this big horse, they think, we're going to bring this inside our fortress. Now, you might think the Trojans were behaving a little bit daft bringing this horse in to their fortress, but they did have their suspicions, and Deiphobus actually asks Helen to sort of test the horse for them to see if it is as empty as it looks. And it's interesting because in this moment Helen actually threatens the Greeks' victory, and it's difficult again to know her motivations, whether she believes Deiphobus when he points out that Menelaus probably wants her dead and she sees the Greek victory as a threat to her life once again, or because she knows that her next actions won't work and therefore she'll prove herself to Deiphobus and in the meantime give the Greeks the upper hand, because what she does is she calls out the names of all of the soldiers she knows might be in this horse, like Odysseus, in the voices of their wives. So she mimics the women in their lives, calling out their names in the hopes that they will sort of jump to these calls and alert the Trojans to their presence. But they don't, they remain entirely silent, and the Trojans are fooled. They're like, cool, this is an empty big wooden horse, great present for us. Until night falls and all of the Greeks come pouring out the horse and, you know, bloody battle ensues. Insert a ton of fighting here. Eventually Menelaus finds Helen, who is in the company of Deiphobus. He's sort of like, you know, guarding her or keeping her to himself, and Menelaus slays Deiphobus where he stands. But this is also the moment in which Helen is confronted by Menelaus's anger, whether he has always wanted her dead or only recently decided he wants her dead, or it's just like a momentary lapse. He is fueled by a lot of violence and hatred in this moment, and a lot of it is directed at Helen. So instead of like wrapping her up in a hug of excitement because he has got his wife back, she's actually imprisoned with the rest of the Trojan women. She's taken as a captive just as all the other women of Troy are, and kept in an encampment with them. And that is the sort of basis for the events in Euripides' play, The Trojan Women, which I mentioned earlier, where you hear the debate and argument between Hecuba, the Queen of Troy, and Helen. The Trojan Women in particular explores the grief of the women of Troy after seeing their homes destroyed, all the men in their life murdered, and now on the precipice of enslavement. Unless you're Helen, whose husband has sworn to execute you on your return home. So Menelaus has sworn that when he returns to Sparta with Helen, he's going to execute her. All of that just to execute her. You really can't make this stuff up. Of course, again, Helen doesn't die, and the next moment of the myth is one that is also quite famous and you might have heard of before, in which Helen actually bares her breasts to her first husband. So she's aboard this ship sailing back to Sparta, and she unwraps her hymation and she exposes herself to her husband. And this, for whatever reason, convinces him not to execute her and instead take her back as his wife. Multiple scholars have offered multiple interpretations of why this exactly worked. It could be that she was reminding him that she is the mother of their daughter through showing him her breasts, or it could have simply been that she was reminding him how beautiful and fab a wife she is. Whatever the reason, however, as I mentioned, it works, and Helen actually returns to her original home. Of course, a lot had changed in that time. Her parents had both died, her brothers had both died, but regardless, she settled down to some sort of normal life, some sort of version of normalcy with her daughter and her husband. And we do get brief vignettes of Helen's life at Sparta after the Trojan War in various Greek sources, including the Odyssey, in which we see Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, visit Sparta on his travels in search of his father, who takes a really long time to get back from Troy, and that's his whole thing in the Odyssey. And he meets Helen there alongside Menelaus. Where was I? So my camera battery died at quite an apt time, really, because this is the point in the video where we sort of come to the end of the road in part of Helen's ancient narration. But I am going to talk a little bit about some of the variations in Helen's myth, at least the main events of Helen's life as they're sort of framed in the ancient literature. These are the events surrounding Helen, which you'll find repeated again and again with slight variations, but which provide this sort of like overview of what happens to her. And generally she'll return home with Menelaus, as I mentioned, and live a pretty normal life. There's not much left to say about what happens to Helen after the Trojan War, except in one version, and that is the version that you'll find in Pausanias's text. So this is not necessarily a mainstream version of Helen's story, but I do think it's worth pointing out because it gives a possible ending to her life, but I wouldn't take from it necessarily a widespread belief amongst ancient Greeks what happens at the end of Helen's life. She may very well have just like died quite happily as an old woman, having like lived out her life. But according to one version of Helen's story narrated by Pausanias, after Helen's return to Sparta, Menelaus eventually passes away, and she is banished from Sparta by his sons. Now these are two sons which Menelaus is said to have had outside of his relationship with Helen, so they're not Helen's children, but they decide to take Sparta from her, a bit unfairly I have to say, given that it was her kingdom originally, but she gets the boot and finds safety with a friend of hers called Polyxo in Rhodes. Except that Polyxo is no longer necessarily Helen's friend, so her husband actually died during the Trojan War and she holds Helen responsible for this. So when Helen is in Rhodes, Polyxo actually orchestrates her death. She disguises her handmaidens as the Furies and sends them in these disguise to capture Helen while bathing and hang her from a tree. So this is one possible tragic ending to Helen's story. However, there are also texts which reference Helen being invited to join her father Zeus on Olympus and live amongst the gods and her brothers in the stars in the afterlife. So it's not all so tragic. But prior to the end of Helen's story, there are also some other moments earlier on in the version that I've narrated to you here where you'll find variations amongst ancient texts that directly contradict the version that I've told you here today. So I also want to talk a little bit more about them, and one of those is actually Helen's parentage. Now you already have the fact that Helen is most likely the biological daughter of Zeus, but raised by her stepfather Tyndareus. There is also the possibility of her mother not being Leda but being Nemesis. So in this version, Nemesis, who is a goddess again, becomes pregnant by Zeus, and Hera, Zeus's wife, who is very jealous of the women who Zeus either sleeps with or attacks, is out to sort of punish her. So Nemesis gives her daughter to Leda and Tyndareus to raise. So in that scenario, Helen isn't the biological child of either Leda or Tyndareus, but the child of two gods, although the Leda version is the more common version. Then probably the biggest variation, the most significant variation in Helen's story is that she was never in Troy at all. So you might have heard of Helen's trip to Egypt. So in this variation on the myth, which is most robustly sort of discussed in Euripides' play Helen, that's where he sort of recounts an entire version of this version. Zeus doesn't want his daughter to go to Troy. He still wants the war to happen, but he doesn't want his daughter to be in harm's way. So he has Hera make a version or a sort of phantom of Helen out of clouds. And this is what Paris abducts. He takes this phantom Helen to Troy, and it's this phantom ghost-like cloud version of Helen which is in Troy for all of the years of the war. Meanwhile, Zeus has Hermes take the real Helen to Egypt, and she remains in Egypt under the protection of King Proteus for the entirety of the war, to the point that when Menelaus, as everything else happens, captures Helen, like retrieves her from Troy and puts her on the ship, it's not Helen, it's still the phantom, and he has no idea. In fact, he only realizes that he doesn't have the real Helen when his ship accidentally lands temporarily in Egypt and he comes across Helen praying, and she actually has to convince him that it's her. She's like, look, it's me, Helen. That's just like a ghost thing. I'm your wife, I've been here all along. Meanwhile, Proteus' son actually plans on marrying Helen, and therefore Helen and Menelaus basically have to come up with this plan to get a ship from the king and his son to escape from Egypt and return back home to Sparta. And if you want to read that full narrative, I highly recommend reading Euripides' play Helen, because I think it's a really, really great play. It's one of my favourite ancient Greek plays. But it's quite a variation on the myth. It can sort of coincide when you think about it, if you don't think about it too hard. Because obviously some of the things that Helen does seem a little unusual if they're just a phantom in the other versions, but it can coincide because there is this phantom version of Helen, and in the meantime she's in Egypt, so really undermining that whole war. But those are some of like the major variations on Helen's tale. Of course there are other minor ones, but I can't cover everything in this video or we'd be here for weeks. What I do want to talk a little bit more about though, before I turn the camera off and go and make my dinner because it's that late in the day, is a little bit about Helen's reception. Now, Helen is a figure that not only was popular in antiquity, but has continued to be incredibly, incredibly popular since. However, in more recent adaptations or versions of Helen that I've come across, I feel more often than not she is flatter and less complex than she sometimes appears in the ancient sources. She often gets boxed in to one category or another, which is either the sort of evil harlot or the innocent, sometimes passive victim. And in that sense, she's sort of been tropified, right? She has been turned into a caricature. And that's not to say there aren't caricaturish versions in the ancient sources, but it's something that feels particularly true of early modern and modern versions. Helen, although a modern version of Helen, is the antagonist in Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan. She's a somewhat romantic heroine who runs away from a man she doesn't love in the film Troy, which, and this is a semi-spoiler for that film, doesn't quite end like we expect the myth to end. But as entertaining as it is to watch, it also feels like a little bit of an oversimplification. And as much as I love the novel, and it had a very important part in my journey to discover and fall in love with classics and ancient Greek mythology, I do find the Helen of Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad, which is a retelling of the Odyssey from the perspective of Penelope, to sort of vilify Helen in its own way. She comes across as incredibly vain and one-dimensional, a sort of judgmental, self-important woman who stands in contrast with the wise, sort of contemplative Penelope, and in some ways I think she's done a real injustice in that novel, and it's not really a very nuanced take on behalf of Margaret Atwood. Again, I love that book and I love a lot of Margaret Atwood's books, but I feel she could have done Helen a lot better in that book, and I think it's the part of the book that really lets it down, unfortunately, because she is sort of oversimplified and vilified in that way. And it's not just sort of modern retailers, you also have to look at the translators. So there was a lot of discussion actually around Helen and her characterization in modern translations with the the publication of Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, because in part it was the first time a translation of the Odyssey had been published in English that had been translated by a woman, but also just because of some of the conversations that arose around the way in which Helen is portrayed. And since then, Emily Wilson has also translated the Iliad, and one of the things that Emily Wilson, the scholar and translator, has pointed out in interviews is that a lot of the most popular, not necessarily all of, but some of the most popular, like, widespread translations of Homer's texts insert a lot of language into them that isn't necessarily there in the ancient Greek. And that's because all translators have biases, all scholars have biases. I have biases. If anybody tells you they don't have biases, they're the most biased person out there, because it's just a lie. It's impossible not to have biases. The best you can do is to try and be aware of them. And particularly if we're looking at historical translations, maybe from the early 1900s or the 1800s, they're particularly influenced by attitudes to women at the time that were very mainstream in academia. And in those translations, you see Helen referred to as a bitch and as shameless, words and language that isn't there, that isn't explicitly used. And like I said before, I find that actually Homer is quite intentionally ambiguous with discussion of Helen and somewhat sympathetic to her. And as Emily Wilson has pointed out, that language carries a lot of modern day meaning with it that isn't necessarily in the ancient text. So this is an idea that's perpetuated beyond like pop culture and media. Scholars are equally as culpable in painting very one-dimensional pictures of Helen. Meanwhile, despite the massive influx in feminist retellings of Greek mythology in the past few decades, and the popularity of retelling Greek myths from the perspectives of different women, I find there hasn't been a great deal of Helen retellings, particularly given the breadth of source material. So there's so much on Helen in the ancient material, yet I have come across far fewer retellings of Helen, and I do try to keep abreast of all of the retellings that are coming out and have come out. I even keep a database on my website that I occasionally update with books I've discovered that retell Greek and Roman myths. And there are a lot of retellings of the Trojan War, like a lot of them, but very few from Helen's perspective. One book which does attempt to sort of highlight the complexity of Helen's story and explore her narrative from the perspective of a real person is Margaret George's Helen of Troy. But since then, I haven't observed a ton of retellings from Helen of Troy or Helen's perspective. Even books like A Thousand Ships by Natalie Haynes, which actually looks at the Trojan War from the perspective of numerous women. So we have women who narrate single chapters of the book, women who narrate multiple chapters, we have goddesses, nymphs, mortals, but nothing from Helen. And I genuinely think A Thousand Ships is a phenomenal book. I really, really love it. But when I was interviewing Natalie Haynes for a podcast a few years ago, she said that it was a very intentional decision not to include Helen of Troy's narrative because she is such an ever-present part of the Trojan War, because she is always there, because she is sort of the woman of the Trojan War. And I think that's a really valid reason not to include her. But at the same time, as much as she's this ever-present symbol of the Trojan War, I think there's actually a massive lack of Helen perspectives in considering the Trojan War, and I actually think it would be phenomenal to read more from the perspective of Helen, because I think she's a very complex character and there's a lot of different ways of interpreting her and portraying her, and a lot of potential within her character. And actually, as I film this video, I'm very aware that there is a Helen of Troy retelling that is coming out very soon, I believe in November in the UK and March in the US, which is Helen's Judgment by Susan C. Wilson, an author who's written a few different retellings of Greek mythology, and I'm very excited for that. Obviously I've not read it, it's not out, I can't comment on the contents, but I'm excited to see that, because for all that Helen is this ever-present ancient Greek woman who lots of people know the name of, I don't think her story often in a modern context gets explored, and I think it deserves to be, is what I'm trying to get at. So she appears, she crops up, she's a side character, she's a name that's dropped and mentioned, she's a presence, she's a symbol, she's a trope, but in some ways has the modern appetite for Greek mythology not somewhat erased Helen because she's so popular? We almost feel like she's not worthy of retelling, when I actually think she's worthy of so much more conversation and so much more discussion, and to be the central character of her own story. So that's something on a personal note that I'd really like to see in the future. But I think that's where I'll bring this video to a close. Helen is such a robust topic. There are so many paintings of Helen, for one, if we want to get into the art world, and I'm sure I've used some of those paintings as sort of props throughout this video, but it's just impossible to cover it all in one video, and I had to be kind of brutal with myself when I sat down to film this, because I actually put it off for quite a while because I was worried about doing the topic justice because there's so much to say, and I was a little bit worried that I wouldn't be able to cover it all, and then I just decided I wouldn't be able to cover it all, and I wouldn't attempt to cover it all. I just wanted to take the opportunity to emphasise how interesting a figure Helen is, to emphasise how complex a character she is, and maybe whet your appetite to read a little bit more. And there are some phenomenal books about Helen out there. One of my favourites, which is actually just behind me here, is Stealing Helen, The Myth of the Abducted Wife in Comparative Perspective by Lowell Edmonds, and this explores not just Helen but other sort of parallels to Helen in mythologies. Then there's Helen of Troy from Homer to Hollywood, which actually does exactly what this video was unable to do really, and traces Helen's history from antiquity to more modern day reception, although not necessarily the most up-to-date versions because Helen's continuing to be talked about. I actually edited and contributed to this volume here, Revisiting Rape in Antiquity, Sexualized Violence in Greek and Roman Worlds, which has a contribution on Helen of Troy, specifically Sex, Violence and Graphics, Illustrating Helen by Karen F. Pierce, which looks at visual depictions of Helen in modern comic books. And that's not the only work that Karen F. Pierce has written on Helen, all of which are incredibly interesting. So a lot to uncover. There's also all of the ancient texts that you can read in order to learn more about Helen, and I'll have a massive bibliography in the description box down below. But hopefully what I have done in this video is again emphasise how interesting and complex Helen is as a character, so that the next time you come across Helen, whether it be Helen, Helen of Troy, Helen of Egypt, Helen of Sparta, you'll think about her as less of a one-dimensional sort of symbolic figure and think about her more as a woman who experienced a lot and went through a lot in Greek myth, and who there is a lot to say on. So in the meantime, I'd love to talk more about Helen in the comments down below. Maybe we can chat a little bit about her, where you first encountered her, what your thoughts are on her. And I'd also love to know if there's anything you'd like to hear about in future video essays, any myths that you'd like broken down into all of their minutiae, any mythological figures you'd like discussed, or their history explored. Let me know. I am here to serve, and until the next time, happy reading. I'll see y'all again soon. Bye everyone!